Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to build an end grain cutting board. I've always wanted to make a cutting board like this, and with several foodies in the family, it's about time I got around to building some. Now this is the prototype, which means we get to keep this one, but hopefully any mistakes I made here don't get transferred to the real ones. Let's see how this guy came together.
This is our current go-to cutting board. It's made of maple, cherry, and walnut, and despite being cleaned up, sanded, and re-oiled a few times, it looks a bit worn. You can see all the knife marks across the grain, and that's kind of the issue with long grain cutting boards. They get beat up pretty quickly. Since end grain is much harder than long grain, it makes for a longer lasting surface, even if the build does take a few extra steps. I'm using some scrap stock for this cutting board. And that means that it's been sitting around for a while and maybe has a little cupping or twisting or internal pressures to deal with. So for starters, I'm going to cut down my stock to smaller lengths before trying to straighten them up. The walnut cut well at the miter saw, but the maple gave me a bit of a struggle. I took the worst of the stock over to the table saw to rip them down to more manageable sizes. Again, the smaller the stock, the easier it is to square it up. You can see here that the maple tried its best to close up as the kerf moves past the blade. If not for my ribbing knife, I'm pretty sure I've had a kickback. Since I don't have a jointer, yet, I use my planer to flatten the first face of my stock. I find the face that has the least amount of rocking and use hot melt glue to fasten it down to a known flat surface, in this case some 3/4 MDF. A few passes through the planer and you can see that my reference lines have disappeared, leaving me with a flat face. Once all of my stock has a flat face, I can plane the opposite faces parallel to the first. I still use pencil marks on the rough face to show when the piece is flat. Once that is done, I can mill all the stock to the same thickness, and here I'm shooting for 3/4 of an inch. I skipped the last step where I would usually square one edge of each board. All of my stock had relatively straight edges, and that was close enough for now. So I moved forward and ripped all the stock to about 1 5/8 inches wide at the table saw. I made sure to keep the 2 or 3 pieces of stock together and in order in the hopes of a cool glue up in the next step. Moving over to my bench, I set up some clamps and set the pairs of stock on them. Now I could flip each pair face to face, so the end grain would give me something close to a book-matched design. It looks better on the walnut than the maple, but then only I will ever notice stuff like this. I use some Titebond 3 to glue up the pairs of stock. This is a waterproof glue and will hold up well on a cutting board. It also has a longer open time, so it's great when you've got a glue up that might take a little time. Once the glue was spread and the parts matched up, I clamped it up and let it set overnight to dry. The next day, I pulled the stock out of the clamps and used my straight edge cutting jig on the table saw to clean up one edge of each piece square to the planed faces. Switching back to my planer, I planed the opposite side of each piece parallel with the one I just ripped. A few passes here and all of the pieces were cleaned up. The last step was to plane one face and one edge at the same setting so the stock would be square. Back at the bench, I laid the pieces on my clamps, making sure that the joints were all facing the same direction. Then I could spread more Titebond 3 and clamp things up to dry. I made sure to keep the pieces in one plane and align the edges to minimize the cleanup in the next steps. While the glue was drying, I grabbed my CA glue to fill the knot here. First I used a thin version to seal the edges and hit it with the activator. Then I came back with a thick version to fill the knot and again used the activator to set it. Once the glue had time to dry, I pulled the stock out of the clamps. The faces were fairly level, so it only took one pass through the planer on each side to clean them up. You can stop here and have a perfectly fine cutting board, or we can take it to the next level. Back at the table saw, I used my crosscut sled to square off one end of my blank. Then I set a stop for 1.5 inches and cut the strips until I ran out of stock. Another trip to the bench for the final glue up. I started by flipping every other strip to create a checkerboard pattern with the end grain facing up. Then I rotated the strips on edge and applied a copious amount of glue. Then it was a matter of setting the strips back in place, keeping the top and edges aligned as best I could. Oh, and that last piece of poplar, that's just a sacrificial piece for the cleanup step. A few taps from my mallet helped straighten things out, a few more clamps, and the board was once again set aside to dry. The next day I set my planer for a light pass to clean up the irregularities from the glue up. Well, it should have been a light pass, but I still got some burning. I was only taking about 1/128th of an inch, and it struggled on the end grain. When planing normally, I take passes at either a 64th of an inch or even a 32nd, so I thought this would be no problem. It might be time to swap out these blades. Oh, and that sacrificial poplar strip? I made sure that it was always the last side to pass through the planer, so that any end grain blowout would happen on that piece and not the cutting board itself. I moved over to the table saw to straighten the sides of the board. I started with the poplar strip against the fence and took a light pass on the opposite side, trying to take as little stock as possible while cleaning up that side. Then I could flip the stock, reset the fence, and trim off the poplar. I snuck up on the cut, again only taking the slightest bit off the maple and walnut. Resetting the fence again, I trimmed the first long side, then the second long side. I used a crosscut blade for all these cuts, but in hindsight, a combination blade might have left a cleaner surface. But mine is in sad shape since I rarely use it. It's time to cut the juice groove, and I used a setup like the one that Tamar over at 3x3 Custom used, and I'll link to her video below. The setup is basically spacers that sit below the surface of the cutting board, and a fence that the router can run against. She even mentioned how she initially didn't keep the router tight to the fence, and that caused a wobble in her first groove. So in honor of her error, I did the same thing. It took me a moment to realize why it happened, but then I figured out I was making a climbing cut, or basically going the wrong direction. Since this is a prototype for me, I left a little whoopsie, flipped the board over, and reset my fence. The second attempt went much smoother. I remembered to move the router clockwise in this setup, and it was much easier to keep the router tight to the fence. I cut my groove in several passes, with the last one being very light to minimize burning. It also helps to keep the router moving at all times, as end grain maple burns very easily anytime the router is stationary, even if it's just for a moment. Along with the juice groove, I thought I'd add finger holds on the end of the board. I swapped out my 1/2 inch round nose for a 1 inch round nose, and set up my router table, fence, and some stops. The fence was set so the groove would be centered in the stock, and the stops allowed for about a 4-inch groove. Then it was plunge down, slide over, and lift off. I repeated the process for the other side, then adjusted the bit depth. Again, taking several passes with the final pass being very light to minimize any burning. I realized after cutting the finger groove that I should have waited and cut that out after rounding over the edges. The bearing of the roundover bit could fall into the groove and ruin the edge. To work around that, I used the router fence with my roundover bit and eased the edges and then the sides. When everything was done, I removed the fence and rounded over just the corners of the face, making sure to stop before the finger holes. Now for the fun part, sanding end grain maple and walnut. I started with 80 grit in my random orbit sander and worked my way through the grits, finishing at 220 grit, making sure to remove all the machine marks, burn marks, and of course any previous sanding marks. To sand the juice groove, I used these rubber sanding dealies that I've had forever. I think they were called tadpoles, and I have several profiles to get into odd shapes. I started with 100 grit paper and worked my way through to 220 grit. The finger holes were too short for the tadpoles, so I just sanded them by hand. The last step is to oil the cutting board. I'm using a food-grade mineral oil that I've been putting on my boards for a while now. I added 3 coats, letting the wood absorb as much oil as possible, and waiting about 15 minutes or so and wiping off any excess oil sitting on the surface. I followed that with 2 coats of a natural wood wax for a little extra protection.
Long grain cutting boards are easy to make, but the few extra steps it takes to make an end grain cutting board are well worth the effort. They look good, the end grain is much tougher, and it'll be much longer before it needs a tune-up. I'd love to hear what you guys thought about this project. Was there something I could have done different, smarter, safer? Drop in the comments below. I'd love to hear. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And as always, if you haven't already, maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. I'm never real sure what's coming up next, but I hope you guys will find it interesting. For now, have a great day, stay safe, and take care. We'll see you soon.